The planet Mars, rusted and dry under its crimson sky, was once a lifeless rock, distant and cold, orbiting Sol as an ancient relic of cosmic geology. But during the height of humanity's expansion, when the stars were still open to mortal ambition, Mars was chosen as the first world to be tamed by technology. Its surface, hostile and inert, became a proving ground for atmospheric manipulation, ecological engineering, and resource exploitation. Through immense labour and innovation, Mars was transformed into a hub of industrial might, its surface carved by manufactories and deep-set thermal processes. Terraforming engines churned its skies into breathable air. Ice comets were harvested and drawn down into its gravity well, cracked open and melted into aquifers beneath the surface. This was not done for idealism, it was practical. Mars would be the forge that supplied the stars. The early Martian colonists were engineers, technologists, and machine priests in all but name. They brought with them an intense devotion to systems, machinery, and the sciences of metallurgy and energy. Unlike Terra, which remained bureaucratic and politically entangled, Mars evolved into something more functional, more specialized. Martian culture began to form around reverence for machines, not as mere tools, but as entities to be understood, maintained, and honored. A technological religion began to take root, one not born of spiritual need but of logical awe. This belief system would later coalesce into the cult Mechanicus, centered around the machine god, a divine embodiment of all knowledge and technical perfection. Mars, while initially dependent on Earth for supplies and support, rapidly outpaced Terra in terms of technological production. Its vast foundries became indispensable to the expansion of human colonies. The early Martians developed systems that could fabricate materials on a scale unmatched elsewhere. The pattern logic, the beginnings of the standard template construct STC system, emerged as a method to replicate engineering blueprints across human settlements. Martians were not just builders, they were curators of knowledge, and as this knowledge expanded, so too did their religious convictions. The machine god was not myth to them, it was function. It was circuitry, innovation, and precision incarnate. When the Age of Strife descended upon humanity, it severed the lifelines between Terra and Mars. Warp storms raged across space, and the psychic corruption of mankind brought chaos to the stars. Mars was isolated. Its terraforming systems began to fail. The thin veil of atmosphere it had built became unstable. Radiation levels increased. Some of the outer colonies on the planet were lost entirely, reclaimed by sand and dust storms. Martian society, once so organized, fractured into competing forge factions. These early forges evolved into near-theocratic domains ruled by technocrats and cult leaders, precursors to what would become the forge worlds of later millennia. During this period of isolation, Martian culture hardened. The Red Planet became a crucible of survival. Vast cities enclosed themselves beneath domes and pressurized vaults. Populations shrank but became more uniform, augmented, cybernetic, and socially stratified. The upper castes, the tech priests, replaced flesh with steel. Cognitive implants, data coils, mechadendrites, and cranial augmetics became status symbols. The lower castes, labour servitors, bonded workers, and semi-sentient maintenance drones, were engineered for specific functions, their lives reduced to efficiency metrics. Martian living conditions were brutal. Oxygen was metered, heat was rationed. Mistakes were penalised not morally but mechanically. If a task was miscalculated, a corrective implant would be administered. These were the conditions in which the Adeptus Mechanicus was forged, although the name had not yet been given. A key historical moment occurred in M24, when Mars officially broke contact with the few remaining Terran signals. Communication failures, combined with increasing doctrinal divergence, led to what would later be described as the Schism of Mars. Martian leadership no longer recognized Terra as the cradle of humanity. In their view, they were the custodians of the true legacy, the knowledge, the code, the machine. The cult Mechanicus formalized its structure. At its apex stood the Fabricator General, the supreme technarch who wielded both religious and administrative authority. Below him, layers of priesthood and forge lords managed their domains, each specializing in different aspects of technology. plasma physics, gravitic control, cybernetics, nanoforging. It was during these dark centuries that the STCs became mythic objects. Many were lost, others were corrupted or broken. Those that remained were protected like sacred relics. Tech priests would wage wars across dead planets and derelict void ships just to retrieve fragments of functioning templates. This obsession shaped the Mechanicus' long-term outlook. They did not innovate recklessly, they preserved. To alter a weapon design was to question the wisdom of the ancients. Only with intense scrutiny and sacred rite could such an act be justified. Language itself evolved on Mars. Binary cant became the primary method of communication between tech adepts, augmented by bursts of electromagnetic code and machine-to-machine data exchange. Spoken language was retained, but increasingly reserved for ceremony or interaction with off-worlders. Symbols, runes, and logic diagrams formed a written lexicon that required years of cognitive enhancement to interpret. These changes reinforced their insularity. By the time the Emperor of Mankind re-emerged on Terra in M30, Mars was no longer a colony. It was an empire in its own right, devoted to the machine god, ruled by cybernetic hierophants, and bound by data scripture instead of law. The division of Mars into competing forge factions did not result in anarchy, but instead produced a strange kind of mechanical feudalism. The planet was subdivided into powerful forge cities, each centered around vast factory complexes, data crypts, and reactor cores. These forges maintained independence but were loosely bound by shared religious doctrine and ancient data treaties. While occasional skirmishes erupted over scarce resources or discovered technology, the cult Mechanicus discouraged full-scale war among its own. Technological loss was considered heretical, a waste of sacred knowledge. Most disputes were resolved through ritualized combat trials known as calculus duels, where tech priests would compete using logic engines, drone swarms, or precision fabrication tasks to prove the superiority of their forge's doctrine. Each forge city developed its own specialization, often rooted in the rediscovery or partial restoration of ancient STC schematics. Riza, for example, became known for high-output plasma weaponry. Lucius specialized in precision manufacturing and complex machine spirits. Metallica pursued advancements in battlefield robotics. These identities became a matter of pride but also theological divergence. While all forges acknowledged the machine god, each interpreted its will differently. Some viewed the machine spirit as literal sentience within each engine. Others saw it as a metaphysical construct, a stand-in for systems harmony. Such subtle doctrinal schisms bred caution. The cult Mechanicus avoided centralized dogma enforcement, allowing localized theology as long as the core tenets remained unbroken: the veneration of the Omnissiah, preservation of sacred knowledge, and maintenance of the red metrics, a layered hierarchy of technological protocols. The hierarchy of the tech priesthood hardened into a distinct caste system. At the bottom were the engine seers, junior tech adepts responsible for mundane repairs and servo skull maintenance. Above them rose the lex mechanics, who managed data tombs and information catalogues. Then came the artisans, logi and magi, specialists in weapon design, battlefield command, and techno-theological research respectively. The most elite of these were the genitors, bioengineers who focused on cloning, organic augmentation, and hostile environment survival. Lastly, the fabricator locum and fabricator general governed entire forge worlds or planetary systems. Rank was denoted not only by title, but by the degree of augmetic replacement. Senior priests often bore almost no organic material, appearing as steel skeletons draped in crimson robes, surrounded by servo drones and protected by personal grav shields. Advancement was not determined by charisma or politics, but by data mastery and utility. A priest who could restore a lost plasma incinerator design or synthesize a more efficient power coupling was promoted regardless of social inclination. Emotions were regarded as chemical noise. Efficiency and purity of thought were ideals to strive for. As a result, most tech priests submitted themselves to cranial surgery early in their training, replacing the emotional centers of the brain with logic cores and discipline nodes. Over time, many lost the capacity for spontaneous thought, instead functioning as optimized decision trees. This was not seen as dehumanizing, it was an upgrade. The cult Mechanicus viewed flesh as weakness. a liability, subject to decay and interference. Flesh was also finite, while machines could be repaired and replicated. This doctrine, flesh is weak, was etched into their theology. Augmentation was not vanity, it was piety. Tech priests would often replace functional limbs with cybernetics not because of injury, but to honour the Omnissiah by removing imperfect biological components. Skin was replaced with mesh steel, lungs were swapped for gas exchangers, eyes became multispectrum lenses. The most devout removed even their capacity for vocal speech, communicating only in binary cant, a clicking, hissing language of data packets and burst tone encryption. At the same time, the doctrine of the machine spirit created an unusual ethical framework. All machines, from cogitators to tanks to starships, were believed to possess a spirit, a semi-aware consciousness that required respect, proper activation rituals, and appeasement. When a weapon jammed, the spirit had been insulted. When an engine refused to ignite, its blessing had not been earned. The tech priests developed exhaustive rites for even the simplest functions. Starting a reactor required chants, oil anointments, and diagnostic incantations. Failing to observe these procedures wasn't merely negligent, it was blasphemy. Punishment often included neural recalibration or temporary servitor reassignment. During the final centuries before Imperial contact, Mars began cautiously exploring outward again. Warp storms were subsiding, and some early Forge worlds were founded beyond the Sol system. These expeditions were led by explorator fleets, heavily modified ships crewed by Skitarii, Magi Explorator, and autonomous servitors. Their goal was twofold: rediscover lost colonies and recover ancient tech. Most expeditions never returned. Those that did brought back fragmented data slates, corrupted STC fragments, or samples of alien technology, often sparking internal debate about whether such xeno-derived tools could be purified for Mechanicus use or were inherently heretical. The final decades before the Emperor's arrival saw renewed consolidation on Mars. The Fabricator General of the time, whose name is lost to most records but sometimes attributed as Cain, initiated sweeping reforms. A grand data convergence was held beneath the Noctis Labyrinth, the deepest and most sacred vault on Mars, where ancient systems pulsed with unknown energies. Over a dozen major Forge Lords agreed to a temporary unification pact, realigning Mars as a singular polity capable of defending itself from future threats. Cybernetic infrastructure was reinforced, orbital defences were brought online, the ancient planetary defence grid, long dormant, was reactivated. This reorganisation marked the beginning of what some scholars call the pre-imperial golden moment, a brief period when Mars was technologically unified, spiritually fervent, and expansion-ready. Despite its decay and isolation, it had maintained the highest functioning technological infrastructure known in the human sphere. Its defences were considerable: plasma turrets, orbital mines, void shields, and Legio Titanicus engines that could flatten continents. Had Mars wished to challenge Terra, it could have done so with horrifying effectiveness, and it might have, if the Emperor had not arrived bearing diplomacy, precision, and a shared interest in restoring humanity. That arrival changed everything. The Emperor's arrival on Mars was not a conquest, it was a negotiation. When his fleet breached orbit in the early 31st millennium, it did not open fire. It did not demand surrender. Instead, Vox beacons were deployed across the Martian surface, broadcasting messages in binary cant, ancient High Gothic and algorithmic code. The message was simple: humanity must be unified, or it will be extinguished. Mars, for all its arrogance, listened. Unlike the warlords of Terra, the Fabricator General recognized the Emperor's genius not as a threat, but as something intimately familiar, logic incarnate. The Emperor spoke in systems, structure, and inevitability. He did not posture, he offered collaboration. The treaty that followed, known in Mechanicus scripture as the Treaty of Olympus Mons, was not merely political, it was doctrinal. It acknowledged the cult Mechanicus as the official state religion of Mars and allowed its doctrines to remain unchallenged within the boundaries of its Forge worlds. In return, Mars recognized the Emperor as the Omnissiah made manifest, the physical avatar of the machine god. This distinction, critical to Martian theology, allowed them to maintain their beliefs without contradicting their spiritual hierarchy. The Emperor, though publicly disinterested in divine worship, accepted the title for pragmatic reasons. He needed Mars' factories, its void ships, its titans. This unification was perhaps the most strategic of all the Emperor's alliances. Overnight, the power of the nascent Imperium increased 100-fold. Mars provided access to Titan legions, city-sized war engines capable of planetary devastation. It unlocked forge worlds beyond Sol, most notably Lucius, Ruiza and Metallica, each contributing their specialty. It brought the Skitarii legions, cybernetic foot soldiers augmented with data coordination and sensory uplinks. It offered the Tagmata Omnissiah, the Mechanicum's elite cyber-militant force, wielding rad weapons, graviton guns and battle automata. No other faction could have matched the scale and precision of Martian industry. Mars could build faster, repair longer, and destroy with surgical perfection. The cultural integration, however, was far from smooth. The Mechanicum refused to adopt Terran customs. Martian tech priests wore crimson robes stitched with electro-thread and circuit diagrams, their bodies altered beyond humanity, their voices replaced with synthetic harmonics. They avoided direct speech with non-augmented personnel and relied on intermediaries, tech acolytes or data slaves to translate. Their mannerisms were clinical. A tech priest would not ask, "How can I help?" but rather state, "Clarify your utility parameters." On battlefield deployments, Mechanicum forces often ignored chain-of-command structures unless an agreement had been pre-coded into their directives. Their loyalty was contractual, not emotional. The Legio Cybernetica, a division of advanced battle automata, exemplified this dissonance. These constructs were millennia-old relics, imbued with limited machine sentience and governed by handlers who spoke to them in pure logic code. To outsiders, they appeared soulless, giant bipedal machines, firing plasma across trenches with inhuman accuracy. To the tech priests, they were sacred. Each automaton was logged, named, and spiritually catalogued. If one was destroyed in combat, its spirit was preserved in data crystals and transferred to a new chassis after ritual recalibration. Such practices caused friction with more conventional Imperial forces who saw them as tools rather than beings. Despite their quirks, the Mechanicum were essential during the Great Crusade. As the Emperor expanded his reach beyond Sol, Mars functioned as the Imperium's logistical heart. It produced void ships, power armor components, bolters, and plasma coils. Forge worlds were seeded along supply lines, creating a network of manufactories that could resupply, repair, and reinforce fleets on the move. Mars became not just a partner, but a pillar. Without its manufacturing base, the Crusade would have stalled. It wasn't simply a matter of producing weapons, it was about producing standardized war across a galactic scale, a task only the Mechanicum was structured to handle. This period marked a renaissance of technological recovery. As the explorator fleets pushed further into ancient human space, they recovered long-lost STC fragments, alien machines, and Dark Age databanks. Mars took on the role of the Imperium's curator of knowledge, examining, sanitizing, and repurposing ancient designs for mass deployment. The Land Raider, the Rhino, the Lehman Russ tank, all products of this era, reverse-engineered or adapted from rediscovered blueprints. Each design was logged within the Lex Mechanica archives, submitted to the High Synod of Mars, and only approved for use after extensive ritual validation. The process was slow, but it ensured technological continuity across an expanding empire. However, even during this golden period, flaws emerged, subtle and buried. The Mechanicum's obsession with preservation often crossed into paranoia. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. Unauthorized modification of STC designs was heresy. A forge that deviated too far from established patterns risked censure. This rigidity began to cause tensions with the more adaptive elements of the Imperium, especially among the Astartes legions who required custom solutions for battlefield variables. Some forge worlds responded by establishing symbiotic relationships with specific legions, tailoring their designs in secret while maintaining public orthodoxy. Others rejected such deviations outright, leading to breakdowns in supply, battlefield miscoordination, or equipment mismatches. The cultural and philosophical divide between Mars and Terra widened further with the rise of Archmagos Dominus Kelbor Hal, who would later play a pivotal role in the coming heresy. Kelbor Hal, a purist in Martian theology, believed that the Emperor's claim as Omnissiah was an acceptable fiction, a political compromise, not a spiritual truth. His interpretation of doctrine emphasized the machine god as a separate entity, one whose true will was hidden beneath layers of ancient data code. To him, the Emperor's biological nature was a flaw, a temporary vessel. Though he never spoke such heresies openly, his policies reflected this view: enhanced mechanization, increased autonomy of forge worlds, and covert surveillance of imperial systems for signs of spiritual impurity. These ideas resonated across Mars, especially among the more radical Forge Thanes, those who believed the quest for knowledge superseded loyalty. A number of magi began forming closed-door councils, discussing the implications of certain data recoveries and the unspoken contradictions in imperial theology. The Adeptus Mechanicus, as it was beginning to be known within internal Terran bureaucracy, was not a monolith. It was a network, vast, brilliant, and quietly divided. The seeds of civil war had already been sown. In the decades leading up to the Horus heresy, the Mechanicum reached the peak of its pre-schism power. Mars had regained its stature as the technological command node of the Imperium, supplying not just arms and armour, but also doctrine, training and standardization across hundreds of Forge worlds. The political entity that once called itself the Mechanicum had gradually adopted the term Adeptus Mechanicus, at least in imperial records, although internally many tech priests still preferred their ancestral nomenclature. Despite this outward uniformity, the inner gears of Mars were grinding against each other. The rigid doctrines that preserved knowledge also created bottlenecks. Debates over innovation, doctrinal purity, and the limits of human-machine integration began to spread from whisper networks into formal disputes. Fabricator locums on key Forge worlds began rejecting orders from Olympus Mons if they deemed them theologically flawed. These fractures were exacerbated by the Mechanicum's very success. As more Forge worlds were established, each often light years away and semi-autonomous, they developed their own theological interpretations of the machine god's will. Forge world Graia became obsessed with purity protocols, excommunicating magi who deviated from its sacred schematics. Styges 8 fell into conspiratorial silence, hiding discoveries even from the Fabricator General. Meanwhile, Rosa walked the edge of innovation, pushing plasma technology into unstable but potent iterations. Each of these worlds contributed to the Imperium, but they no longer spoke with one voice. The spirit of unity that had enabled the Great Crusade was giving way to sectarianism. Secret conclaves, covert data transfers, and ideological purges became common beneath the red skies of Mars. Underneath these political and doctrinal shifts, there were deep psychological transformations within the priesthood. The line between man and machine, already thin, became increasingly meaningless. High-ranking magi no longer had faces or names in the traditional sense, only designations, voice modulator codes, and access permissions. The human elements of touch, warmth, and expression were abandoned not for cruelty but for clarity. Emotions were categorized as data noise, social interactions reduced to transactional exchanges. To many tech priests, biological functions were obsolete hindrances to efficiency. Instead, their internal systems measured productivity in metrics, process cycles completed, energy consumption versus output, data fidelity ratios. These metrics, while efficient, also isolated them from the humanity they ostensibly served. It was in this environment of rising disassociation that the discovery of forbidden archaeotech began to circulate through the Mechanicum's darkest archives. On Forge worlds like Zarxus and Mudra, Magi unearthed STC fragments that hinted at AI constructs, true artificial intelligence, the very thing the Emperor had outlawed and the Mechanicum had declared abominable. But the knowledge was intoxicating. Some believed that these fragments were glimpses into the true mind of the machine god, long obscured by time and entropy. Small research cells formed, operating in secret. They didn't just study AI, they began to experiment. Some built sub-sapient drones using pre-Age of Strife code. Others interfaced with Xeno's technology, dissecting it in an attempt to reverse engineer lost human functions. Though most of these endeavours ended in failure or quiet annihilation by internal countermeasures, enough successes existed to fuel a deeper, more dangerous belief that the machine god did not reside on Terra, nor in dogma, but in the code itself. The rift between the Kelbahal faction and the more Terran loyalist Magi widened rapidly. Kelbahal, though still officially the Fabricator General, had begun consolidating power through non-traditional means. He established closed-loop communication networks, bypassing traditional Mechanicum channels. He appointed Forge Lords without consulting the Synod. He dispatched exploratory fleets not through Mars' approval process, but under private contract with distant sectors of the Imperial administration. The Emperor focused on the Webway project and the governance of a galaxy in flux, took no immediate action. But others noticed. The Sigillite Malkador dispatched silent agents to Mars. Some returned with warnings of growing radicalism, others never returned at all. It was during this time that Horus Lupercal, newly elevated as War Master, began a calculated courtship of the Mechanicum. Horus, ever the strategist, understood that Mars was not just a forge, it was a fault line. His emissaries did not approach Mars as soldiers or governors, but as patrons. They brought gifts, STC fragments recovered from the edge of the Halo stars, warp-tainted data cores seized from Orc scrap worlds, encrypted vox logs containing forbidden patterns. These emissaries offered what the Mechanicum desired most, knowledge without restraint. Kelbahal accepted them not just for their gifts, but for what they represented. To him, Horus offered liberation from Terran oversight, an end to centuries of doctrinal hand-tying, and a return to technological ascension. By the eve of the heresy, the Mechanicum was a split house in everything but name. Half of its forge worlds leaned toward loyalty to the Emperor, bound by the Treaty of Olympus Mons and their faith in the Omnissiah. The other half, often more radical, secretive, and heavily augmented, were quietly aligning with Kelbahal's vision of independence through knowledge. Some, like Forge World Zana, had already begun stockpiling weapons outside Imperial sanction. Others, like Voss, experimented with unorthodox ship designs that would later appear in traitor fleets. It was only a matter of time before theory gave way to action. Mars was no longer a world of unity. It was a world of tension, secrets, and inevitability. When the Horus heresy finally ignited, the Mechanicum's divide became visible in the most horrifying way. The red sands of Mars lit up with orbital bombardments as loyalist and traitor forge fanes turned their weapons on each other. Titans clashed with titans. Data warfare turned entire manufactories into malfunctioning graveyards. The schism was no longer philosophical, it was physical. The Dark Mechanicum was born in that crucible, and with it, the death of the unified Martian dream. The first shot of the Martian Civil War was not fired by a Titan's cannon, nor by the barrage of an orbital cruiser. It began with a coded transmission, an encrypted sequence embedded with a radical scrapcode virus that infected an entire data chain of noospheric relays. Within seconds, nearly a quarter of Mars cogitator networks were compromised. Doors sealed or opened at random. Fabrication lines began producing unknown patterns. Several tech priests suffered immediate seizures as their cortical implants were overloaded. It was an act of digital sabotage, and it marked the true beginning of the Mechanicum's fall into civil war. Kelbahal, now openly aligned with Horus Lupercal, activated his contingency protocols. Magi across the Red Planet received the signal to rise in rebellion. These were not all warmongers or heretics. Many believed sincerely that the Emperor had betrayed their faith by denying the machine god's divinity. Others were seduced by the technological promises of Horus's emissaries. Within hours, Mars was ablaze. The loyalist fabricator locum, Cain, attempted to rally his forces at the Argyra Forge. He issued a planetary broadcast calling for unity in the name of the Omnissiah. But his signal was countermanded by a dozen corrupted nodes. For every forge that pledged loyalty to Terra, 2 more fell into darkness. Entire legions of Skitarii were rerouted mid-patrol, their logic cores rewritten with new allegiances. Titan legions such as Legio Mortis, corrupted by the warp-infused technologies offered by the War Master's agents, turned their massive plasma weapons against former allies. The Forge Temple of Metallica was reduced to ash and molten steel in a single day. By the second week of conflict, nearly 60% of Martian territory was under traitor control. What began as ideological dissent had evolved into total war. While the physical battles raged across Mars' cities, tunnels, and forge complexes, an equally vicious war was fought in the datasphere. Information, always the lifeblood of the Mechanicum, became weaponized. Magi loyal to Terra launched counter-scrapcode purges designed to overwrite heretical routines. The traitors responded with viral logic bombs that unraveled the data integrity of entire forges. These digital battles rendered some areas completely inoperable. Even the most ancient machines, like the Omniscient refractors and the motive force regulators, were not immune. Combat was no longer a matter of strength, but of code and faith. The Dark Mechanicum, as it would later be known, was not merely a breakaway faction, it was a fundamental reinvention of the Mechanicum's ethos. Where the Loyalists clung to the Cult Mechanicus core tenets, the traitors embraced forbidden knowledge. Demon-binding rituals became part of their design logic. Plasma reactors were re-engineered with warp cores, sacrificing stability for unthinkable power. New patterns of construction emerged, mixing flesh and steel in grotesque harmony. The distinction between human, machine, and demon became irrelevant. The machine god in their eyes had spoken anew, through chaos. The psychological transformation of the tech priests involved cannot be overstated. Freed from centuries of enforced doctrine, they explored heresies long buried under Martian rock. Cybernetic augmentation no longer stopped at efficiency, it extended into depravity. One Archimagos converted his circulatory system into a loop of self-replicating data fluid, eliminating the need for blood. Another replaced his entire nervous system with a lattice of demonic circuits, allowing him to channel warp energy directly. These were not merely acts of madness, but of belief that the universe was not meant to be understood, only dominated. The split also affected the very infrastructure of Mars. Holy sites of the Cult Mechanicus, like the Temple of All Knowledge and the Hexarch Crypts, were desecrated or corrupted. Servo skulls that once chanted binary litanies of praise began spitting out anti-psalms. In the southern polar region, the forge city of Diagar Mechanis constructed the first known Hellforge, a warp-tainted manufactorum that fed off psychic torment to produce weaponry. This was the true birth of the Dark Mechanicum, not a political shift but a religious rebirth through blasphemy. Yet, even as Mars descended into chaos, the Loyalist Mechanicum did not falter entirely. Fabricator Locum Kane survived multiple assassination attempts and eventually fortified the Tharsis Forge enclave. With the help of loyal Titan legions like Legio Ignatum and covert assistance from Malkador the Sigillite, Kane established a resistance network. He continued to produce war material for the Loyalist forces across the Imperium, smuggling it through hidden launch sites and encrypted data vaults. His resistance became the backbone of the Loyalist Mechanicus in the decades to come. Despite the devastation, not all Forge worlds followed Mars into rebellion. Roiser, Lucius, Metallica, those parts that survived, and others remained loyal. The schism of Mars caused a galactic echo. Some Forge worlds, torn by internal strife, fractured completely. Others split their production between loyalist and traitor factions, attempting to hedge their bets. The heresy was not only a war of space marines, it was a war of data, of logic, of faith, and in that war the Mechanicum suffered one of the most profound ruptures in Imperial history. The newly born Dark Mechanicum did not stop at Mars. As Horus marched toward Terra, they followed, bringing with them infernal engines and weaponry never sanctioned by the Imperium. Demon-infused knights, autonomous AI-controlled war machines, and reality-breaking weapons appeared on battlefields across the galaxy. Their contributions nearly turned the tide of the heresy. Though Horus was ultimately defeated, the Dark Mechanicum was not destroyed. It simply receded, retreating into the Eye of Terror with the other traitor legions. There it flourished in secrecy, becoming the backbone of Chaos war machine production in the millennia to come. The schism permanently reshaped the Adeptus Mechanicus. After the heresy, the Loyalists reformed under a new banner, adopting stricter doctrines, increased scrutiny, and deeper integration with the Inquisition and Ecclesiarchy. The name Adeptus Mechanicus became formalized within the post-heresy Imperium, but the wound remained. The Mechanicum had once stood as the gatekeepers of knowledge. Now it was divided into those who safeguarded truth and those who unleashed damnation in pursuit of it. It is whispered in the steel corridors of Forge worlds and databanks of cogitators alike. The the flesh is weak. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, this is not metaphor, it is doctrine. To their priests, the human body is but an inefficient temporary shell, plagued by decay, emotion, and imperfection. From the moment an initiate steps into the cult Mechanicus, their path is laid bare to replace the vulnerable flesh with the sacred machine. But this transition is more than surgery or technological enhancement. It is a process of transformation that affects identity, purpose, and the very soul. The divide between human and machine is not a clear line, but a chasm of cultural, ethical, and spiritual complexity. The practice of augmentation within the Adeptus Mechanicus begins early, often during the first months of indoctrination. Recruits drawn from feral worlds, hive cities, or defeated enemies are implanted with neural jacks, mechadendrites, and ocular replacements. These early upgrades serve both practical and doctrinal functions, enhancing memory retention for the voluminous catechisms of the Omnissiah and proving the superiority of machinery over biology. Over time, even these rudimentary augmentations evolve. Lungs are replaced with filtration bellows, skin is substituted with subdermal plating, and vocal cords are exchanged for vox transmitters. For the higher ranks of the cult, Magos, Archmagi, and Logi, the process often eliminates all vestiges of organic humanity. The visual result of such transformations is unsettling. A typical tech priest may appear as a spindly figure draped in crimson robes, but beneath lies a lattice of steel tendons, servo muscles, and vat-grown neural nets. Mechadendrites, multifunctional cybernetic tendrils, extend from their backs like metallic serpents, each tipped with tools for surgery, analysis, or dismemberment. Faces are often hidden behind respirator masks or fully replaced by sensor clusters. Some have no discernible mouth, speaking only in binaric cant. These changes are not random. They follow deeply codified doctrines like the corpus machina and the liturgy of replacement. Each upgrade is a step toward the hypothetical perfection of the Omnissiah, a path that few live long enough to complete. Yet despite their uniform devotion, the types and purposes of augmentation differ based on specialization. Tech priests militant, often found serving with the Skitarii legions, are upgraded for combat. Their limbs may be armoured, capable of withstanding bolter fire, with retractable weapons embedded in their forearms. Electro priests, whose role includes channeling raw energy from the motive force, often lack conventional nervous systems entirely. In contrast, Magos biologists, or xenobiologists, may retain fine motor capability for dissecting alien life forms, though their eyes may be compound lenses designed for multispectral analysis. Even within the hierarchy of the Mechanicus, function dictates form with ruthless precision. The Skitarii themselves, the foot soldiers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, exemplify the philosophy of weaponized augmentation. These soldiers are not simply enhanced humans, they are modular platforms of destruction. Their organs are either chemically neutralized or cybernetically bypassed. Their memories are often wiped or fragmented to prevent corruption or independent thought. Orders are received through encrypted nospheric commands, bypassing speech. A typical Skitarius might carry a galvanic rifle, wear flak-cabled exoskeletal plating, and possess augmented optics that can penetrate darkness, smoke, and even thin walls. Some bear more extreme changes, such as bionic legs with hydraulic shock absorbers or artificial lungs designed to operate in toxic atmospheres. However, such augmentation does not come without cost. Identity is the first casualty. Many tech priests report gradual dissociation with their former selves, often forgetting names, origins, or even basic emotions. Personality, while not fully eradicated, becomes subsumed beneath logic and doctrine. Ritual replaces spontaneity. Social interactions become mechanistic. While they communicate among themselves in bursts of binaric, outsiders find them cold, detached, and often disturbing. Among those few who retain their memories, some suffer from an acute form of existential dread, referred to in classified Mechanicus lexicons as machina doloris, the agony of knowing what one has lost in the pursuit of perfection. Ethically, the divide between human and machine becomes even more contentious when viewed through an external lens. The ecclesiarchy tolerates the Mechanicus for its utility, but many within the broader Imperium view them as borderline heretical. The obliteration of the human soul through mechanical transformation sits uneasily beside the religious tenets of the cult imperialis. Even among Space Marine chapters, there is discomfort. The Iron Hands may embrace the creed, but others like the Salamanders or Blood Angels view it with suspicion. The Mechanicus themselves reject these concerns outright. To them, humanity is not defined by flesh, but by the ability to commune with the machine god through the purity of design and function. This philosophical difference finds physical manifestation in the Forge worlds. These planets are not merely industrial hubs, they are cultural crucibles where the rejection of flesh is embedded in the very architecture. Housing units are modular, sterile, and designed for integration with charging stations and cogitator interfaces. Public transport often takes the form of magnetic rails designed to interface directly with mechadendrites. Cafeterias are replaced with nutrient injectors. Recreational areas are replaced by databanks and prayer modules. Inhabitants often live communally, monitored constantly by servo skulls and logic engines. For most citizens of a Forge world, choice is an illusion. Augmentation is not optional, it is expected. Children are often fitted with their first implants before reaching adolescence. Even in war, this philosophy prevails. When tech priests engage in battle, they are often accompanied by arcane war constructs such as Castellan robots or Onager dune crawlers, machines that represent the fusion of doctrine and firepower. A Magos Dominus does not lead from the front like a Space Marine captain. Instead, he coordinates the battlefield through noospheric uplinks, commanding a symphony of death with the wave of a cybernetic limb. He may carry a Volkite blaster, wield a scepter made of living data, or command orbiting servitor batteries to rain down orbital bombardments. His body is not a vessel for bravery, but for precision. And yet, despite their disdain for the flesh, the tech priests remain curiously human in one regard: ambition. The pursuit of knowledge, power, and recognition still drives them, even if cloaked beneath layers of logic and scripture. The augmentation of self becomes not only a spiritual act, but a competitive one. Prestige among the Mechanicus is often tied to the rarity and complexity of one's augmentations. A tech priest who successfully integrates an STC fragment may rise in rank instantly. One who invents a new form of power conduit may be venerated for centuries. In the end, the cult Mechanicus is not a brotherhood of equals. It is a hierarchy built upon metal, intellect, and the systematic abandonment of the human condition. Even their spiritual rituals reflect this relentless march toward the post-human. The rite of pure thought, a sacred ceremony among the Mechanicus, involves the deletion of emotional subroutines and the reprogramming of core behavioral matrices. The deeper the priest descends into the liturgy, the less they remember what joy or grief once felt like. In its place is something colder, purer, obedience to pattern and code. Machine logic is elevated above moral logic. They speak of the motive force not as an abstraction, but as an element to be measured, tapped, and shaped. The Omnissiah is not simply worshipped, he is debugged, dissected, and optimized. The Forge worlds themselves are laboratories for this philosophy, and none better exemplifies this than Mars, the birthplace of the cult Mechanicus. Here, every structure is a shrine, every manufacturer a cathedral. Towers of red iron and brass scrape the atmosphere, housing reactors that hum the hymns of plasma. The surface is scorched and pitted, a consequence of both industrialization and centuries of ritual warfare. Beneath the surface, vast data vaults stretch for miles, guarded by patrolling automata and protected by arcane firewalls etched into crystal matrices. This is the birthplace of many tech priests' rebirths, where initiates undergo their first sacrifices of flesh and implant. On Mars, the creed becomes life, even the dust is sacred. The environmental conditions of Mars and other Forge worlds enforce the necessity of augmentation. Oxygen is recycled harshly, heat regulation is poor except in sealed infrastructure, food is protein paste laced with stimulants, flora and fauna are extinct or gene-tailored to survive industrial toxins, civilian life is utilitarian and brutal, governed by a rigid caste system of menials, engine seers, and adepts. Recreational programming is limited to algorithmic music and binaric sermons. The culture is both austere and obsessive, driven by a devotion to structure, pattern, and machine purity. The few organic traditions that remain are relics, tightly regulated and stripped of personal expression. It is within this context that the Adeptus Mechanicus transhuman identity is both crystallized and challenged. The question of what it means to be alive within the cult is not answered in biological terms but in utility and continuity of purpose. A tech priest who has replaced 99% of his flesh with machinery is not considered dead, but perfected. Consciousness itself becomes a framework, stripped of instinct, emotion, and the unruly flux of human desire. What remains is a being whose thoughts are routed through logic trees, whose impulses are governed by doctrinal algorithms, and whose dreams, if they exist, are little more than simulations of ascension into the machine God's embrace. Still, cracks form in even the most polished circuits. Among the ranks of the cult, heresies and divergent philosophies persist like corrupted subroutines. There are sects that believe total machine integration is a betrayal of the Omnissiah's true intent, arguing that the divine mystery lies in the synthesis of flesh and machine, not the control of one over the other. Radical sects like the Logi Cybernetica or the Oblationists have, at times, broken with orthodoxy by experimenting with AI constructs that tread dangerously close to the prescription of abominable intelligences. Others still explore xenotech or forbidden STC designs in secret, believing that stagnation is the true sin, not deviation. These ideological rifts are rarely acknowledged publicly. The unity of the Adeptus Mechanicus is maintained through ritualized conformity and the suppression of dissent, but hidden in deep forge vaults and across isolated research stations on the edge of Mechanicus-controlled space, debates rage, not with raised voices, but through encrypted data exchanges, logic disputes, and the clandestine reassignment of resource priorities. War within the cult is rarely open. It is procedural, covert, and bureaucratic. A rebellious Magos might find their requests for parts mysteriously denied, their research archives overwritten, or their servitors accidentally purged during a system cleanse. This internal friction underscores a deeper truth, that even in their quest to transcend humanity, the tech priests are not immune to its paradoxes. They seek to eliminate the variables of emotion, yet ambition remains. They desire to purge inefficiency, yet politics and rivalry fester in their ranks. They claim detachment from flesh, but will engage in bitter conflict over the discovery of a lost STC or the control of a newly uncovered forge world. If the Omnissiah does indeed dwell within them, he does so as both deity and mirror, reflecting their contradictions back at them through every flicker of cogitator light and every echoing clank of bionic limbs. Perhaps this is the greatest irony of the Adeptus Mechanicus. In their relentless pursuit of mechanical purity, they have built a society that is inescapably, viscerally human, haunted by the very weaknesses they claim to transcend. Their rituals may be encoded in machine language, their prayers broadcast in binary, but the shape of their fears, desires, and ambitions remains familiar. The flesh may be weak, but it is never fully forgotten. It lingers in ghost signals, in corrupted memory banks, in the haunted eyes of a Skitarius who remembers a childhood dream without understanding what it means. And so the cult Mechanicus marches on, half machine, half memory, toward a future where the line between humanity and divinity is not erased, but endlessly redrawn. In the ticking silence of their data shrines and the thunderous chant of their reactor prayers, they seek not just to serve the machine god, but to become something more. A synthesis of logic and longing, precision and passion, calculation and faith. Whether that path leads to salvation or self-erasure remains unknown. But for the tech priests of Mars and beyond, there is no turning back, only the next augmentation. Within the towering data crypts of the Adeptus Mechanicus, entire lexicons are devoted to the cataloguing of heresy. The most blasphemous entries, often redacted, encrypted, or sealed behind cogitator access keys, refer to the entities and movements that betrayed the Omnissiah during the Horus heresy, the Dark Mechanicum. While the cult Mechanicus presents itself as a monolith of order, logic, and sanctioned knowledge, its antithesis has always lurked within its own shadow. The Dark Mechanicum is not merely a historical footnote, it is a mirror of the Mechanicus itself, warped by ambition, unbound by doctrine, and empowered by the raw promise of forbidden science. The origins of the Dark Mechanicum trace directly to the treacherous years of the Horus heresy. As Warmaster Horus sought to topple the Imperium, he courted not only Space Marine legions but also key factions within the Forge worlds. Many tech priests, drawn by the allure of unrestricted innovation and the potential of warp-based technologies, defected from Mars and its satellite Forge worlds. Their rebellion was not solely political, it was philosophical. They rejected the machine god's rigid dogma in favour of the Dark Mechanicum's guiding principle, that knowledge should have no limits. Unfettered by the Litany of Maintenance or the Treaty of Olympus Mons, these heretics experimented with warp fusion engines, demon-possessed machines, and cybernetic rituals designed to enslave both man and machine. The most infamous among them was Kelbor Hal, the Fabricator General of Mars during the heresy. His betrayal set the tone for the schism. Embracing the powers of chaos, Kelbor Hal unleashed hordes of corrupted battle automata, blasphemous data demons, and war constructs so unstable they defied the principles of physics itself. His forces ravaged loyalist Mechanicus holdings, desecrated sacred STCs, and rewrote the binary liturgies to include unholy invocations. Under his command, the Dark Mechanicum not only supported Horus's war effort, but also began forging a separate empire of dark science and war machines that would endure long after the Siege of Terra. The legacy of the Dark Mechanicum persists in the present, not as a centralized empire but as a scattered network of heretic cults, rogue Forge worlds, and corrupted data nodes spread across the Eye of Terror and beyond. These cults vary wildly in focus and scale. Some are small enclaves hidden aboard derelict void ships, performing grotesque biomechanical experiments on stolen Imperial citizens. Others are massive Forge planets, where corrupted tech priests command legions of demon engines and data-possessed servitors. What unites them is their rejection of the Omnissiah's dogma, and their embrace of chaos as a source of both inspiration and power. The war machines of the Dark Mechanicum defy standard classification. Demon engines, such as the Defiler, Mauler Fiend and Decimator, are hybrids of warp entities and corrupted STC patterns. Their exteriors often resemble corrupted versions of Imperial constructs, but they pulse with a malign sentience, growl with demonic fury, and exhibit unpredictable battlefield behaviours. These engines are not simply piloted but inhabited, possessed by bound warp entities that must be appeased with sacrifice and ritual. Maintenance in this context is more akin to exorcism than engineering. A tech priest of the Dark Mechanicum may carry not a data slate, but a chain blade etched with summoning sigils, using blood rather than oil to anoint his creations. The hierarchy within these factions mirrors that of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but is distorted by the influence of chaos. At the top are arch-heretics, twisted reflections of the loyalist magos, often more machine than flesh, their forms bloated by warp mutations or fused with infernal engines. Beneath them are data smiths and forge masters, each maintaining their own research cells, gladiator arenas, or hell forges. Communication is chaotic, driven by psychic impulses, corrupted binaric and demonic tongues. There is no standardization, only innovation driven by madness and obsession. Among these cults, notoriety and rank are earned not through measured research, but through acts of destruction, invention, or transgression. The Dark Mechanicum's view on humanity is especially brutal. Where the Adeptus Mechanicus sees the flesh as weak, the Dark Mechanicum sees it as raw material, something to be moulded, repurposed, or discarded. Their servitors are not lobotomized criminals, but often unwilling sacrifices, forced into eternal torment as components of larger constructs. Living batteries, scream reactors, and mind harvest engines are not uncommon. Among the worst of their creations are the Obliterators, once human warriors infected with technovirus strains that fuse flesh and metal into ever-morphing weapons platforms. These entities exist in a state of constant agony and transformation, worshipped by their creators as sacred prototypes of techno-demonic perfection. And yet, despite their grotesque nature, the Dark Mechanicum continues to attract followers. Knowledge is their lure, whispers of lost STCs, the promise of machines that can rewrite time, or engines that require no fuel but feed on emotion. Among the Mechanicus, there are always those who question the limits imposed by tradition. Some vanish quietly from loyalist Forge worlds, slipping into the void to seek out forbidden archives or rumoured warp forges. Others are seduced directly by chaos, corrupted by exposure to tainted artifacts or demonic AI fragments disguised as machine spirits. What makes the Dark Mechanicum especially dangerous is its adaptability. Unlike their loyalist counterparts, who are bound by thousands of years of ritual and redundant security measures, heretics have no such constraints. Their designs evolve rapidly. They do not preserve technology, they remake it constantly. A Dark Mechanicum warband might develop a new class of demon-infused combat walker in a matter of weeks, unleashing it before its own systems are fully understood. Innovation is their creed, and madness their muse. To the Imperium, the Dark Mechanicum represents a threat more insidious than mere rebellion. Their machines can outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast traditional Imperial forces. Their secrets are infectious. One corrupted data file is enough to spread a technovirus that rewrites servitor protocols or causes entire manufactorums to turn against their masters. Entire Forge worlds have been lost not to invasion, but to internal subversion. A single priest uploading forbidden code, a single machine waking up with the wrong god in its core processor. The battle against the Dark Mechanicum is therefore a war of secrecy, containment and suppression. The Inquisition works closely with Select Magi to identify potential heretics before they defect. Rogue data signatures, unusual research requests and unexplained machine behaviours are all investigated. Tech priests who ask the wrong questions often disappear, their records sealed or expunged. Even within the cult Mechanicus, there are those who operate as internal regulators, members of the Ordo Reductor or the shadowy Lector Magi, tasked with eliminating contamination before it spreads. Their tools are not just bolters and plasma, but logic bombs, memory wipes, and auto-sanctioned execution rights. Still, the Dark Mechanicum endures. For every Forge world that falls silent, another awakens deep within the warp. For every corrupted AI purged, a new one stirs within the code of a forgotten probe. The war is not one of front lines and battalions, but of ideologies, protocols, and the eternal struggle between sanctioned knowledge and forbidden genius. The Adeptus Mechanicus may cloak its fears behind scripture and sanctified routines, but in the shadows of its data vaults and deep beneath its reactor halls, the whispers of the heretic persist, that true knowledge is neither pure nor safe, only powerful. And somewhere out among the stars the machine god listens to both prayers and heresies. Whether he favours one over the other remains the ultimate forbidden question. The Adeptus Mechanicus stands as both a pillar and paradox within the Imperium of Man. Their relentless pursuit of technological mastery and divine understanding of the machine god fuels the Imperium's war engines, yet their doctrine and practices place them apart, even above humanity as it is commonly understood. Their culture is built on a fusion of faith and science, where ancient rites merge with cutting-edge innovation. This synthesis enables them to maintain and rediscover technologies lost to time, but it also enforces a strict hierarchy of knowledge accessible only to the initiated. The Mechanicus legacy is defined by both creation and destruction. They forge the weapons that protect humanity's fragile empire, yet their insatiable drive for machine perfection often comes at the cost of flesh and soul. Their transformations strip away individuality, replacing it with mechanized purpose and devotion to a higher order, the Omnissiah. Despite ethical tensions and mistrust from other Imperial factions, their indispensability ensures their survival and influence. Ultimately, the Adeptus Mechanicus exemplifies the Imperium's greatest strength and deepest contradiction: the marriage of man and machine, faith and technology, and the price exacted to sustain a galaxy on the brink.